Bullies shredded her new dress. She left bruises they'll never forget. The autumn morning air carried the scent of dying leaves and impending rain as Kira Montrose adjusted her oversized forest green cardigan for the third time in as many minutes. The wool fabric, soft from countless washings, provided a comforting barrier between her and the harsh fluorescent lighting of Westfield High School's main corridor. At barely 5 feet tall, with a slight frame that seemed to disappear entirely when she hunched her shoulders just right, she had perfected the delicate art of human invisibility, a skill that had become as essential to her survival as breathing itself. Her thick-rimmed glasses, a pair of vintage tortoiseshell frames that had belonged to her grandmother, sat perfectly positioned on the bridge of her small nose. Through them, her dark brown eyes, the color of rich coffee beans, her mother had always said, scanned the crowded hallway with the methodical precision of a surveillance camera. Every face was catalogued, every potential threat assessed and filed away in the complex mental mapping system she had developed over the past 3 months. Her long black hair, pinned straight and lustrous, despite her attempts to make it look unkempt, fell like a protective curtain around her face. She had learned to use it strategically, angling her head so that the silky strands created shadows that obscured her expressions, making it nearly impossible for casual observers to read her emotions. It was a technique that had served her well in the previous schools she had attended, though none of those experiences had quite prepared her for the particular brand of social warfare that seemed to flourish in the suburbs of Ohio. 3 months and 4 days had passed since the moving truck had pulled away from their modest 2-story house in Oregon, leaving tire tracks in the gravel driveway and taking with it everything familiar and safe that Kira had known. Her mother's job transfer, a promotion that she couldn't refuse, both financially and professionally, had landed their small family in this sprawling suburb where manicured lawns stretched endlessly and every house looked like it had been designed by the same architect who had apparently never heard of creativity or individuality. Everything about this place felt foreign and unwelcoming to Kira. The accents were sharper, more nasal than the soft, measured tones she was accustomed to hearing in the Pacific Northwest. The social hierarchies were more rigidly defined, carved in stone rather than the fluid, ever-changing dynamics she remembered from her previous schools. And the students, the students seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to detect weakness, vulnerability, or difference from miles away, like predators who had evolved specifically to hunt the wounded and the isolated. "Look who's trying to become one with the lockers again," came a voice that never failed to make Kira's stomach clench with a mixture of dread and barely suppressed anger. The sound of those perfectly modulated syllables, dripping with false sweetness and genuine malice, had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, and infinitely more unwelcome. Madison Pierce approached with her signature predatory smile, the kind of expression that looked beautiful from a distance, but revealed its true ugliness when examined up close. She was everything that Kira was not: tall without being awkward, confident without being arrogant, beautiful in the effortless way that came from good genetics and unlimited access to high-end beauty products. Her blonde hair had been styled into perfect beach waves that probably required 2 hours of professional attention each morning, and her outfit, a designer ensemble that probably cost more than Kira's family spent on groceries in a month, fit her like it had been custom-tailored, which it probably had been. Behind Madison, following in her wake like faithful disciples who had found their golden calf, came her loyal inner circle. Trevor Walsh towered over most of the other students at an imposing 6 feet and 4 inches, his broad shoulders and muscular frame the result of countless hours in the weight room and on the basketball court. His intelligence seemed to exist in inverse proportion to his physical development. The larger his biceps grew, the smaller his capacity for empathy appeared to become. His square jaw and blue eyes might have made him attractive, if not for the cruel gleam that perpetually danced in his gaze when he looked at anyone he perceived as weaker than himself. Chen completed the trio, serving as Madison's second-in-command and chief strategist in their ongoing campaign of psychological warfare. Where Madison's cruelty was direct and theatrical, Ashley's was subtle and surgical. She had perfected the art of delivering devastating insults while maintaining an expression of innocent concern, and she seemed to take particular pleasure in finding and exploiting the specific vulnerabilities that would cause the maximum amount of emotional damage to her targets. "I swear she gets smaller every day," Ashley commented now, her voice carrying just the right amount of mock worry to sound genuine to any adults who might be listening. "Maybe she's actually shrinking, like physically dissolving from the sheer force of her own awkwardness." Kira continued walking at her steady, measured pace, clutching her textbooks tighter against her chest. The books, worn paperbacks and heavy hardcovers that bore the evidence of countless previous students, had become both her shield and her anchor. When the world felt like it was spinning out of control, when the walls of the hallway seemed to be closing in around her, she could focus on the familiar weight of them in her arms, and remember that there were other worlds beyond this one, other stories where the quiet, awkward girls sometimes turned out to be heroes. She had learned through bitter experience that engaging with Madison and her followers only made things exponentially worse. Any response, no matter how calm or reasonable, would be twisted and used as ammunition for future attacks. Any sign of emotion would be catalogued and exploited. The only winning move, she had discovered, was not to play, though even that strategy had its limitations, as her tormentors seemed perfectly capable of manufacturing drama out of thin air when necessary. The trio fell into step behind her, their designer shoes clicking against the polished linoleum floor in a rhythm that had become as familiar and ominous as a funeral march. Their voices carried just loud enough for her to hear every carefully crafted barb, each word chosen for maximum impact and minimum accountability. "Did you see what she wore yesterday?" Madison continued, her tone suggesting that she was discussing a particularly fascinating scientific phenomenon rather than deliberately humiliating another human being. "I'm pretty sure my grandmother had the exact same sweater. I think she donated it to charity sometime around 1987, which means our little fashion icon here must shop at some truly vintage establishments." The laughter that followed Madison's observation felt like dozens of tiny needles pricking at Kira's skin. Each chuckle and snicker a small but deliberate wound designed to erode her sense of self-worth, one microscopic piece at a time. But she maintained her pace and her composure, drawing on reserves of inner strength that most of these privileged teenagers couldn't even imagine possessing. What they didn't know, what nobody in this sterile suburban wasteland knew, was that beneath her carefully cultivated exterior of mousy vulnerability lay years of rigorous training that had shaped her into something entirely different from what they saw. Her quiet demeanor wasn't the result of natural timidity or social inadequacy. It was the product of iron discipline and a deep understanding of her own capabilities. Her father, Staff Sergeant Michael Montrose, had served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan before retiring from the Marine Corps and transitioning into civilian life as a security consultant. From the time Kira was 6 years old, barely old enough to tie her own shoes, he had enrolled her in martial arts classes that went far beyond the trendy after-school activities that most suburban parents used to keep their children occupied and out of trouble. This wasn't the watered-down, commercialized version of martial arts taught at strip mall dojos, where everyone eventually earned a black belt regardless of their actual skill level. This was serious, no-nonsense training in Krav Maga and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, taught by instructors who had learned their techniques in real-world situations where failure meant injury or death. By the time she turned 14, Kira could take down men twice her size using leverage, technique, and an intimate understanding of human anatomy that would have impressed medical students. But along with the physical skills came an even more important lesson that her parents had drilled into her consciousness with the same relentless repetition they used to teach her proper stances and breathing techniques. Violence, they had taught her, should always be the absolute last resort, used only when no other options remained and when the threat was immediate and undeniable. "Your strength is not a toy," her father had told her countless times, usually while they cooled down after particularly intense training sessions. "It's not a tool for solving problems or settling scores. It's a responsibility that you carry with you every day, and the weight of that responsibility should never feel light. When the time comes, and I hope it never does, that you need to use what I've taught you, you end the threat quickly, decisively, and then you walk away. You don't escalate. You don't seek revenge. You don't use your abilities to make yourself feel powerful at someone else's expense." The problem that Kira faced now, walking through the hostile territory of Westfield High School with her tormentors trailing behind her like a pack of well-dressed wolves, was determining exactly when the threshold had been crossed from mere harassment into something that constituted a genuine threat requiring a physical response. Was daily humiliation enough to justify breaking the solemn promise she had made to her parents? Was having her lunch deliberately knocked from her hands in the cafeteria while dozens of students watched and did nothing worth risking the consequences that would inevitably follow if she revealed her true capabilities? Each day brought new challenges to her resolve, new tests of her commitment to the principles her parents had instilled in her. Each small cruelty and calculated humiliation chipped away at her self-control like water slowly eroding stone, and she found herself spending more and more time calculating angles and pressure points, imagining scenarios where she finally allowed her training to take over and showed these privileged bullies what real strength looked like. The chemistry laboratory had become Madison's favorite hunting ground for their psychological safaris, primarily because Mr. Henderson, their perpetually distracted teacher, had developed the unfortunate habit of stepping out during hands-on experiments to smoke cigarettes in the faculty parking lot, leaving 30 teenagers unsupervised with potentially dangerous chemicals and equipment. It was during one of these absences that Madison had discovered just how much she enjoyed making Kira's academic life a living nightmare in increasingly creative and destructive ways. "Oops," Madison said with exaggerated innocence as she deliberately bumped into Kira's laboratory station, sending a carefully measured mixture of hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide splashing across 3 months' worth of meticulously taken notes. "How incredibly clumsy of me. I'm such a klutz sometimes." Kira watched in helpless silence as her careful handwriting, neat rows of chemical formulas, detailed diagrams of molecular structures, and pages of observations that represented hours of dedicated study, dissolved into an illegible mess of smeared ink and dissolving paper. These weren't just random notes that could be easily replaced. They were the comprehensive study guide she had been building for the upcoming midterm examination, each page representing not just academic effort, but her desperate attempt to maintain the high grades that were her only hope of earning a scholarship to a decent university. She looked up at Madison, who wore an expression of such calculated innocence that it would have been comical if it weren't so infuriating. For just a moment, no more than a heartbeat, Kira felt her carefully controlled posture shift almost imperceptibly as muscle memory from years of training began to take over. Her weight automatically distributed to the balls of her feet, her center of gravity lowered by perhaps an inch, and her hands began to form the basic preparatory position that her father had drilled into her during countless hours of practice. She calculated the exact angle and force that would be required to put Madison on the floor in a way that would look accidental to any witnesses. A simple trip, maybe, or a collision that sent the taller girl sprawling while Kira maintained perfect balance. 2 seconds of action, maybe 3 at the most, and Madison would understand exactly what kind of mistake she had just made. Instead, Kira reached for the paper towels and began cleaning up the acidic mess that was slowly eating through her 3 months of hard work, each careful dab of the absorbent paper feeling like a small act of surrender. "You know," Madison said, leaning closer so that her voice wouldn't carry to the other students in the lab. "I heard through the grapevine that your family moved here because your father got fired from his last job. Something about inappropriate conduct, maybe. Is that why you dress like someone who does all their shopping at thrift stores and church rummage sales?" The lie hit Kira like a physical blow, primarily because it was so far from the truth that it felt like Madison had reached into her chest and twisted something vital. Her father had taken early retirement from his consulting job, a decision that had cost their family significantly in terms of financial security, specifically so that he could care for her grandfather, who was fighting a losing battle against pancreatic cancer. The move to Ohio hadn't been about professional failure or personal scandal. It had been about family loyalty and the kind of sacrifice that people like Madison couldn't begin to understand. But explaining the truth would require engaging with Madison on a level that Kira had sworn to avoid, and engagement always, inevitably, made everything worse. It gave Madison new information to twist and weaponize, new vulnerabilities to exploit in future attacks. "I think I touched a nerve," Ashley chimed in from her position as lookout near the classroom door, her voice carrying just enough false sympathy to sound convincing to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. "Look, I think she's about to start crying. Should we get her some tissues?" But Kira didn't cry, though the effort of maintaining her composure felt like trying to hold back a dam with nothing but willpower and determination. She had learned years ago that tears were nothing more than ammunition for people like Madison and Ashley, emotional vulnerability that would be stored away and used against her at the most devastating possible moment. Instead, she finished cleaning up the chemical spill with methodical precision, disposed of the contaminated paper towels in the appropriate waste container, and moved to a different laboratory station on the opposite side of the room, leaving the 3 tormentors to find their entertainment elsewhere. The pattern continued for weeks that stretched into months, each day blending into the next in an endless cycle of small humiliations and casual cruelties. Kira would arrive at school each morning with her armor of oversized clothing and practiced invisibility firmly in place, navigate through her classes while avoiding direct confrontation, eat her lunch alone in the farthest corner of the library where the dusty stacks of outdated reference books provided both physical and psychological shelter, and count down the minutes until she could escape to the relative safety of her family's rented house. Her parents, both intelligent and observant people who had spent their entire adult lives reading other people's emotions and motivations, noticed the gradual change in their daughter's demeanor and behavior. The girl who had once chatted excitedly about her classes and teachers had become increasingly quiet and withdrawn. The teenager who had previously complained about moving to a new state had stopped mentioning school entirely, as if that part of her life had become too painful to discuss even in the safety of their home. But when they gently probed for information about her adjustment to Westfield High School, Kira deflected their questions with the same skill she used to avoid her tormentors. Everything was fine, she assured them. The classes were challenging but manageable. She was making friends, slowly but surely. The teachers were helpful and supportive. She was just focused on her studies, that was all, determined to maintain the high grades that would secure her future. Her parents, trusting in their daughter's maturity and resilience, attributed her subdued mood to the normal challenges of adjusting to a new school and a new social environment. They had moved several times during Kira's childhood due to her father's military service, and she had always eventually found her footing in new situations. There was no reason to believe that this time would be any different. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in late October when Kira made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her entire high school experience. Standing in front of her bedroom mirror, surrounded by the familiar comforts of her carefully arranged personal space, she decided to wear something different, something that reflected who she actually was rather than who she had been pretending to be. Her mother had bought the dress for her 16th birthday 2 months earlier, a simple but elegant navy blue piece with a modest neckline and a hem that hit just below her knees. The fabric was a high-quality cotton blend that felt substantial without being heavy, and the cut was classic enough to be appropriate for school while still being sophisticated enough to make her feel like a young woman rather than a girl trying to disappear. For weeks, the dress had hung in her closet, like a symbol of the life she wanted to live, a life where she could express herself honestly, where she could take pride in her appearance, where she could participate in the normal social rituals of teenage life without fear of consequences. This morning, looking at her reflection in the same oversized sweater and baggy jeans that had become her uniform of invisibility, she decided that she was tired of hiding. She paired the dress with low-heeled pumps that her grandmother had given her for graduation from middle school, shoes that made her feel elegant and mature. She left her hair down for the first time in months, allowing it to fall in natural waves around her shoulders instead of pulling it back into the severe ponytail that had become her default style. She even applied a small amount of makeup, just enough to enhance her natural features without looking overdone. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a different person. Not the invisible girl who had been surviving at Westfield High School, but the confident, intelligent young woman she had been back in Oregon. For the first time since arriving in this suburban prison, she felt like herself. The morning began better than she had dared to hope. Students she didn't know, classmates who had looked right through her for months, actually made eye contact and smiled as she walked through the hallways. A girl from her English class complimented her dress while they waited for the teacher to arrive. Even some of the teachers seemed to notice her in a way they hadn't before, as if she had suddenly materialized from thin air rather than having been sitting in their classrooms for the entire semester. For the first time since arriving at Westfield High School, Kira felt like she might actually have the potential to belong somewhere other than the margins of social existence. Then she saw him. Daniel Rodriguez was sitting alone at a corner table in the far reaches of the cafeteria, the kind of isolated spot that was usually occupied by students who preferred solitude to the exhausting performance of teenage social interaction. He was sketching in a worn notebook while mechanically eating a sandwich that looked like it had been assembled with more attention to nutrition than aesthetics. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that partially obscured his eyes as he concentrated on his artwork, and there was something about his focused intensity that made Kira pause in her usual routine of buying lunch and retreating to the library. Unlike her own chosen silence, which was born from fear and self-preservation, Daniel's solitude seemed deliberately chosen rather than imposed by circumstances beyond his control. There was a quality to his quiet presence that suggested depth rather than withdrawal, creativity rather than defeat. When he looked up from his sketching and caught her watching him from across the crowded cafeteria, his smile was genuine and warm. The first real smile she had seen directed at her since arriving in Ohio. It was the kind of smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. not the polite but hollow grimace that she had become accustomed to receiving from classmates who were performing friendliness rather than feeling it. For reasons she couldn't entirely explain, even to herself, Kira found herself walking toward his table instead of toward her usual refuge in the library. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness and the steady quality of her voice. The words seemed to come from some deeper part of herself, the part that remembered what it felt like to be confident and social and unafraid. "It is now," Daniel replied, closing his notebook with a careful precision that suggested the contents were both personal and precious. "I'm Daniel. I don't think we've been formally introduced, though I've seen you around." "Kira," she said, settling into the chair across from him and realizing that she couldn't remember the last time she had voluntarily sat down next to another student. "And no, we haven't officially met." They talked for the entire lunch period about everything and nothing. The books they loved, the movies they had seen recently, the way the afternoon light streaming through the cafeteria windows created interesting shadows on the institutional white walls. Daniel, she discovered, was an artist in the truest sense of the word, someone who saw beauty and meaning in things that most people overlooked or dismissed as mundane. When he talked about his drawings, his entire demeanor changed. His voice became more animated, his gestures more expressive, and his eyes lit up with a passion that was both infectious and deeply appealing. He showed her some of his sketches, portraits of classmates captured in unguarded moments, detailed studies of architectural elements around the school, abstract compositions that seemed to capture emotions rather than specific objects. "You're really talented," Kira said, genuinely impressed by the skill and sensitivity evident in his work. "These are incredible." "Thank you," Daniel said, and she could tell that the compliment meant something to him. Most people think art is kind of a waste of time. They're always asking what you're going to do with it, how you're going to make money from it, whether it's practical. Those people don't understand that some things are valuable even if they can't be monetized, Kira replied, thinking about the poetry she wrote in secret, the stories she crafted in the privacy of her bedroom, the creative outlets that kept her sane in an increasingly insane world. For the first time in months, Kira found herself genuinely laughing, not the forced, performative laughter that she sometimes used to deflect uncomfortable situations, but real amusement that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her chest. The sound surprised her with its richness and authenticity. "You have a great laugh," Daniel said as the warning bell rang, signaling that lunch period was drawing to a close. "You should do it more often. You seem like you don't get many opportunities to laugh around here." Kira felt heat rise in her cheeks, a blush that was part embarrassment and part pleasure at being seen so clearly by someone who was still essentially a stranger. "Maybe I will," she said, gathering her things and realizing that she meant it. As they prepared to part ways for their afternoon classes, Daniel hesitated for a moment, as if weighing the potential risks and benefits of his next words. "Would you maybe want to sit together again tomorrow? I mean, if you don't have other plans or other people to sit with." "I'd like that very much," Kira said, and the sincerity in her voice surprised them both. She floated through her afternoon classes in a state of cautious optimism that felt foreign after months of careful emotional numbness. For the first time since arriving at Westfield High School, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included friendship, acceptance, and the possibility of genuine happiness. She replayed their conversation in her mind, analyzing Daniel's words and expressions for signs of authentic interest versus polite tolerance, and found herself looking forward to tomorrow's lunch period with an anticipation that felt almost dangerous in its intensity. The feeling of hopeful possibility lasted until she reached her locker at the end of the school day, her arms full of textbooks and her mind still pleasantly occupied with thoughts of artistic techniques and shared laughter. Madison was waiting for her, but this time the usual dynamic had shifted in ways that made Kira's survival instincts immediately spring to high alert. Madison wasn't alone with her typical followers. Trevor and Ashley flanked her as usual, but they had been joined by 3 other students that Kira didn't recognize. Older kids with the kind of predatory confidence that suggested they had graduated from mere social bullying to more serious forms of intimidation. Well, Madison said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that Kira had never heard before. Look who decided to play dress-up today. How adorable. Did someone finally tell you that looking like a homeless person wasn't actually a fashion statement? Kira's hand instinctively moved toward her locker combination, but Trevor stepped forward with deliberate intimidation, his considerable bulk blocking her access to her books and her escape route. We saw you making friends with the art freak, Ashley added, her tone suggesting that she had witnessed something far more scandalous than a simple conversation over lunch. How sweet. The 2 biggest losers in school found each other. It's like a fairy tale, if fairy tales were about pathetic people with no social skills. I heard he likes you, Madison continued, beginning to circle Kira like a predator that had cornered its prey and was savoring the moment before the final attack. Too bad he's going to find out what you really are underneath all that fake confidence. Too bad he's going to realize that you're nothing special, just like everyone else already knows. Before Kira could process what was happening, before her training could kick in or her defensive instincts could engage, Madison reached out and grabbed the fabric of her dress at the shoulder seam. The sound of expensive cotton tearing echoed through the hallway like a gunshot, causing nearby students to stop their conversations and turn toward the source of the disturbance. But Madison wasn't finished with her demonstration. She grabbed another section of the dress, the carefully constructed neckline that had made Kira feel elegant and mature, and pulled with deliberate force, creating a jagged tear that exposed her bra strap and a significant portion of her chest to the growing crowd of onlookers. Oops, Madison said with the same mock innocence she had employed in the chemistry lab, but amplified now by the presence of an audience and the intoxicating rush of absolute power over another human being. I guess you'll have to go back to shopping in the clearance bins where you belong. Maybe try the thrift stores next time. They might have something more appropriate for someone of your social status. The group of students erupted in laughter that felt like a physical assault, the sound bouncing off the metal lockers and fluorescent lights to create a cacophony of cruelty that seemed to fill every corner of the hallway. Kira stood frozen in the center of the growing circle of spectators, clutching the torn fabric of her beautiful dress together in a desperate attempt to preserve what little dignity remained to her. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her exposed skin, could hear the whispered comments and barely suppressed giggles of students who were recording her humiliation on their phones for later distribution across social media platforms. The dress that had made her feel confident and beautiful just hours earlier now hung in tatters around her small frame, transformed from a symbol of hope into evidence of her vulnerability. At the far end of the hallway, partially hidden behind a group of seniors, she could see Daniel watching the scene unfold. His face was a mixture of shock, anger, and helpless concern, and she could see him taking a step forward as if he wanted to intervene, but wasn't sure how to do so without making the situation worse for both of them. Maybe next time you'll remember your place, Madison announced, her voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the corridor and ensure that her message would be heard and understood by the maximum number of witnesses. Some people aren't meant to stand out. Some people are meant to stay invisible, and when they forget that lesson, sometimes they need to be reminded. The circle of students began to disperse as teachers started appearing in the hallway, their entertainment concluded and their phones full of content that would provide them with conversation topics for days to come. Madison and her expanded entourage walked away with the satisfied air of people who had accomplished exactly what they had set out to do, leaving behind a scene of destruction that they would never have to think about again. Kira stood alone in the rapidly emptying hallway, surrounded by the scattered remnants of her dignity and the growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with this place and these people. The girl who had arrived at school that morning full of hope and possibility was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the true nature of the war that was being waged around her. Daniel appeared at her side as if materializing from thin air, quickly shrugging off his worn denim jacket. "Here," he said quietly, his voice gentle but urgent as he draped the jacket around her shoulders, carefully adjusting it to provide maximum coverage for her torn dress. "Are you okay? That was... God, I can't believe they did that." Kira wanted to say something, to thank him for his kindness, or to explain what had just happened, or to apologize for the spectacle that she had inadvertently created. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't usually the kind of person who attracted this kind of attention, that she had been trying so hard to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation, that she was sorry he had to witness her humiliation. Instead, she ran. She ran through the hallways, past the remaining clusters of students who turned to stare as she passed, past the teachers who pretended not to notice the obvious signs of distress written across her face, and out into the parking lot, where her mother was waiting in their modest sedan to pick her up from what was supposed to have been just another ordinary Tuesday at school. "Kira, what happened?" her mother asked, taking in her daughter's torn dress, the oversized jacket that clearly didn't belong to her, and the expression of devastation that she was trying unsuccessfully to hide. "Honey, talk to me. What's wrong?" "I want to go home," Kira whispered, and she meant far more than just their rented house with its beige walls and temporary furniture. She wanted to go back to Oregon, back to her old school where she had been respected and liked, back to a version of herself that hadn't been systematically dismantled by months of psychological warfare. That night, Kira sat in her bedroom, staring at the torn dress that now hung in her closet like the corpse of her former optimism. Her mother had offered to take it to a seamstress to see if the damage could be repaired, but Kira knew with absolute certainty that some things couldn't be fixed. The fabric would never be the same, and neither would she. She thought about Daniel's kindness, about the way he had immediately moved to protect her dignity, even after witnessing her complete humiliation. She thought about the laughter that had followed her down the hallway, about the way Madison had looked at her like she was something dirty that needed to be swept away and disposed of. But mostly, she thought about the moment when Madison had first grabbed her dress. For just an instant, no more than a heartbeat, Kira had felt her body automatically shift into a defensive stance that years of training had made as natural as breathing. Her muscles had tensed with muscle memory, her weight had shifted to her center of gravity, and her hands had started to form the basic position that her father had drilled into her during countless hours of practice. She had calculated the exact angle and pressure that would be required to drop Madison to the floor, had mentally mapped the precise sequence of movements that would end the confrontation before it could escalate. 2 seconds of action, maybe 3 at the most, and Madison would have understood exactly what kind of mistake she had just made. Then she had remembered her parents' words about restraint, about being better than those who would hurt others, about using her strength only when absolutely necessary for protection. She had stood there and taken the humiliation, believing that enduring the attack without retaliation was somehow the morally superior choice. Now, sitting in the darkness of her room and feeling the weight of every small cruelty and calculated humiliation that had been inflicted on her over the past months, Kira began to wonder if she had been fundamentally wrong about everything. Maybe restraint wasn't always the right choice. Maybe there were situations where allowing yourself to be victimized was actually the greater moral failure. Maybe some people only understood one kind of language, and maybe it was time for her to start speaking it fluently. The next morning, Kira dressed carefully in her usual armor of oversized clothing and practiced invisibility. But something had changed in her demeanor overnight. There was a new stillness to her movements, a different quality to her silence that spoke of decisions made and lines drawn in the sand. She had decided to find Daniel and apologize for running away the previous afternoon, and maybe to thank him properly for trying to protect her when no one else had seemed to care. She found him at his usual corner table in the cafeteria, but he wasn't alone. Madison and Trevor were standing over him, and even from across the crowded room, Kira could see the tension in Daniel's shoulders, the way he was gripping his pencil like it was the only thing anchoring him to sanity. She moved closer, using the crowd of students and the strategic placement of support pillars to stay hidden while getting close enough to hear their conversation. "I heard you played knight in shining armor yesterday," Madison was saying, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that always preceded her most vicious attacks. How romantic, a real hero coming to the rescue of the damsel in distress. "Leave me alone, Madison," Daniel said quietly, his eyes fixed on his notebook as if he could will himself to disappear through sheer concentration. "I haven't done anything to you." "Oh, I don't think so," Trevor interjected, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that came from years of using his size and social status to intimidate smaller, quieter students. "I don't think we're done with you yet." He reached over and grabbed Daniel's notebook, the same notebook that contained months of careful artwork, the same sketches that Daniel had shared with such pride and vulnerability just 24 hours earlier. "What's this? Love letters to your girlfriend? Or maybe just some pathetic drawings that nobody cares about?" Daniel lunged for the notebook, desperation overriding his usual caution, but Trevor held it high above his head where the smaller boy couldn't reach it. "Actually, these are pretty good," Trevor continued, flipping through the pages with deliberate carelessness. "It would be a real shame if something happened to them." "Give it back," Daniel said, his voice tight with the kind of anger that comes from watching something precious being destroyed for no reason other than someone else's entertainment. "Or what?" Madison asked, stepping closer so that she was invading his personal space in a way that made him visibly uncomfortable. "You'll run crying to a teacher, just like your little girlfriend ran away yesterday when things got too real for her?" Trevor began tearing pages from the notebook, letting them flutter to the floor like autumn leaves, while Daniel watched his months of work being destroyed in real time. Each torn page represented hours of careful observation and artistic development, irreplaceable expressions of creativity and passion that were being casually obliterated for the amusement of people who couldn't create anything themselves. "Please," Daniel said, and the broken quality in his voice, the sound of someone watching their dreams being murdered in front of them, made something fundamental shift inside Kira's chest. She had endured months of humiliation because she believed in restraint, because she had been taught that violence was always the wrong choice, because she had convinced herself that being better than her tormentors meant allowing them to continue their campaign of destruction without consequences. But watching Madison and Trevor systematically destroy something that brought Daniel joy, seeing the pain in his eyes as his artwork was scattered across the dirty cafeteria floor, Kira realized that she had been catastrophically wrong about everything. Some things were worth fighting for, some people deserved to be stopped, and sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to make the guilty understand that their actions would have consequences. The realization hit her like a physical blow, rewriting everything she thought she knew about morality and justice and the proper use of the abilities her father had spent years teaching her. She had been so focused on being the bigger person that she had forgotten there were people who interpreted kindness as weakness, who saw restraint as invitation, who would continue hurting others until someone made them stop. The final confrontation came 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon in the school parking lot, when most of the teachers had already gone home, and the remaining students were focused on their weekend plans rather than the systematic destruction of another human being's dignity. Madison had orchestrated it perfectly, spending the week building anticipation throughout the school's social media networks and informal communication channels. Word had spread that there was going to be a show after classes ended, and she had somehow convinced herself that she was untouchable, that her social status and her family's wealth would protect her from any meaningful consequences for her actions. "I don't know why you even bother coming to school anymore," Madison called out as Kira walked toward her mother's car, her voice carrying across the parking lot with theatrical projection. "Everyone knows you're a joke. Everyone knows you don't belong here." Kira stopped walking, but didn't turn around. Behind her, she could hear footsteps as Madison, Trevor, and Ashley approached, along with what sounded like a growing crowd of students who had been drawn by the promise of entertainment and the possibility of witnessing another spectacular humiliation. "Did you hear me?" Madison demanded, moving to position herself directly in front of Kira so that she couldn't continue toward her escape route. "I said you're a joke. A pathetic, friendless loser who can't even dress herself properly without falling apart." "I heard you," Kira said quietly, adjusting her backpack on her shoulders with a casual movement that concealed the way she was testing her balance and range of motion. "Then why aren't you running away?" Madison continued, emboldened by what she interpreted as passive acceptance of her dominance. "That's what you do, right? Run away and hide whenever someone tells you the truth about yourself." For the first time in months, Kira looked directly at Madison, really looked at her, seeing past the carefully constructed facade of popularity and privilege to the insecure, cruel person underneath. She saw the calculated cruelty in those blue eyes, the way Madison carried herself like someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions, the casual entitlement that came from growing up in a world where her worst impulses had always been enabled and excused. "I'm not running away," Kira said, her voice steady and clear, carrying a quality that made several students in the growing crowd take an unconscious step backward. Madison laughed, but there was something forced about the sound now, a hint of uncertainty that suggested she was beginning to sense that the usual dynamic had shifted in ways she didn't understand. "Oh, so now you want to talk? Too bad. I'm bored with you." She reached out to shove Kira hard in the chest, the same move that had worked countless times before on countless other victims. It was a simple gesture of dominance, designed to send Kira stumbling backward while demonstrating Madison's physical superiority to the watching crowd. But this time, her hand never made contact. Kira moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years training her body to react faster than conscious thought. She caught Madison's wrist, twisted it at an angle that immediately disabled the aggressive movement, and used Madison's own momentum to send her stumbling backward into Trevor, who was too surprised to maintain his balance. The parking lot went silent, except for the sound of Madison's gasp and Trevor's muttered curse as he tried to regain his footing. "You ruined my dress," Kira said, her voice carrying across the silent parking lot with perfect clarity. "You destroyed Daniel's artwork. You've spent months trying to make me feel small and worthless and afraid." "So what?" Madison shot back, but there was a tremor in her voice now that hadn't been there before, a crack in the facade of absolute confidence that suggested she was beginning to understand that she had made a serious miscalculation. "So now it's my turn." The change in Kira was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood body language and combat readiness. Her shoulders squared without appearing tense, her stance widened slightly to improve her balance and mobility, and her hands hung loose at her sides in a deceptively relaxed position that would allow for maximum speed and flexibility when she needed to move. Years of training had taught her to appear calm even when she was most dangerous, to project an aura of controlled capability that would give her opponents a chance to reconsider their choices before she was forced to make those choices for them. Madison must have sensed something because she looked to Trevor for backup, her usual confidence replaced by a growing awareness that she might have pushed too far this time. "Are you going to let her talk to me like that?" Trevor stepped forward, his size advantage obvious to everyone watching, and his confidence restored by the familiar weight of his own physical superiority. "You heard her," he said, reaching out to grab Kira's shoulder in the same move that had worked countless times before on countless other targets. "Back off, freak." But this time, his hand never made contact either. Kira moved faster than anyone in the crowd thought possible, faster than Trevor's reflexes could process or counter. She caught his wrist, twisted it at a precise angle that compromised his balance and leverage, and used his own momentum combined with a carefully applied foot sweep to send him crashing into the side of a nearby car with enough force to leave a visible dent in the door. The impact echoed across the parking lot like a gunshot, and Trevor collapsed to the asphalt, clutching his arm and making sounds that were somewhere between groans and whimpers. The silence that followed was absolute and profound, broken only by Trevor's labored breathing and the distant sound of traffic from the main road. Madison stared at Kira in shock, her carefully constructed worldview suddenly rearranged by the impossible sight of someone she had categorized as powerless and weak, demonstrating capabilities that she couldn't begin to understand. "What did you just do?" "I defended myself," Kira replied with perfect calm, as if discussing the weather or a homework assignment rather than having just disabled a person twice her size in less than 3 seconds. "Is that a problem?" Ashley had started backing away from the confrontation, her survival instincts finally overriding her loyalty to Madison and her desire to be part of the dominant social group. But Madison was too invested in her own mythology to retreat, too committed to the persona she had built around being untouchable and superior. "You got lucky," Madison said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence and authority. "Trevor wasn't ready for you. He underestimated you." "Would you like to test that theory?" Kira asked, and something in her tone, something that spoke of absolute certainty and controlled violence, made Madison take an involuntary step backward. For months, Madison had enjoyed the intoxicating rush that came from making others feel small and powerless. She had built her entire identity around being the predator rather than the prey, around having the social status and family wealth that protected her from consequences and enabled her worst impulses. But now, looking at Kira's calm expression and remembering how easily she had disabled Trevor, Madison began to understand that she might have made the kind of mistake that couldn't be undone with apologies or explanations or appeals to authority. "You can't just attack people," Madison said, but the words came out as a question rather than a statement, lacking any real conviction or authority. "Like you attacked me?" Kira asked, her voice still perfectly level and controlled. "Like you attacked Daniel? Like you've been attacking everyone you decided was beneath you?" The crowd that had gathered to watch what they assumed would be another routine humiliation had grown larger, drawn by the unprecedented sight of someone standing up to Madison Pierce and the dramatic reversal of the school's established power dynamics. Among the faces in the crowd, Kira spotted Daniel, his expression a mixture of concern and something that might have been admiration or respect. Madison looked around at the watching students, many of whom were recording the confrontation on their phones, and realized that for the first time in years, she was the one being stared at, judged, and found wanting. The position of vulnerability was so foreign to her that she seemed unable to process it effectively. "This isn't over," Madison said, trying to reclaim some authority and control over the situation, but the words came out weak and desperate rather than threatening. "Yes, it is," Kira replied with absolute certainty, and something in her tone made it clear that this wasn't a negotiation or a discussion, but a simple statement of fact. Madison made her crucial mistake then, the decision that would define how this confrontation ended and how she would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. Instead of walking away, instead of accepting that she had encountered someone who wouldn't be intimidated or controlled, she let her pride and ego override what should have been obvious self-preservation instincts. She lunged at Kira with her nails extended, aiming for her face in a wild, undisciplined attack that was driven more by desperation and wounded pride than by any coherent strategy or technique. Kira caught Madison's wrist before those perfectly manicured nails could make contact, applied a controlling technique that brought Madison to her knees instantly, and held her there with the kind of clinical precision that spoke of years of serious training. The move was designed to cause significant discomfort without permanent damage, and it worked exactly as intended. Madison gasped as pressure was applied to nerve points and joint angles that she didn't even know existed, her face contorting with pain and shock at finding herself completely helpless and at the mercy of someone she had consistently underestimated. "I could break this," Kira said conversationally, maintaining the controlling hold while speaking in the same tone she might use to discuss lunch plans or weekend activities. "I could dislocate your shoulder. I could put you on the ground and make sure you never felt superior to anyone again." Madison's eyes were wide with pain and a fear that was entirely new to her. The terror of someone who had suddenly realized that the world contained people who were fundamentally more dangerous than she was, people who could hurt her in ways she had never imagined. "But I won't," Kira continued, her voice still perfectly calm and controlled. "Because unlike you, I'm not a person who enjoys causing unnecessary pain. Because unlike you, I understand that strength should be used to protect people, not to hurt them for entertainment." She released Madison's wrist and stepped back, watching as the taller girl collapsed to her knees on the asphalt, cradling her arm and staring up at Kira with a mixture of shock, pain, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. "If you ever come near me again," Kira said, her voice carrying to every corner of the parking lot and ensuring that her message would be heard and understood by everyone present. "If you ever touch my things, if you ever hurt Daniel or anyone else I care about, I won't be nearly so generous next time." She looked around at the crowd of students, many of whom had been complicit in her months of torment through their silence and inaction, their willingness to be entertained by someone else's suffering rather than taking the moral risk of intervention. "That goes for all of you," she continued. "I'm done being your entertainment. I'm done being the victim in your little social dramas. Find someone else to pick on, or better yet, find something better to do with your time." The crowd began to disperse with unusual speed, students hurrying away as if they suddenly remembered urgent appointments or homework assignments that required their immediate attention. Trevor was helped to his feet by Ashley, both of them avoiding eye contact with Kira as they limped away from the scene of their humiliation. Madison remained on her knees for a moment longer, processing the fundamental shift in power dynamics that had just occurred and trying to understand how someone she had dismissed as weak and worthless had just demonstrated the kind of controlled violence that professional fighters would respect. When she finally stood, her usual arrogance and entitlement had been replaced by something that Kira had never seen in her before: genuine fear and the beginning of what might eventually become wisdom. "I'm sorry," Madison said quietly, the words seeming to cost her considerable effort, but carrying a sincerity that surprised them both. Kira studied her for a moment, looking for signs of manipulation or calculated performance, but found only the shell-shocked expression of someone whose entire understanding of the world had been fundamentally altered in the space of a few minutes. "Don't do it again," Kira said simply, and something in her tone made it clear that this was both a warning and a promise. As Madison walked away, her shoulders slumped in defeat and her usual confidence nowhere to be seen, Daniel approached Kira with careful steps, as if he wasn't sure whether the person he was approaching was still the same quiet girl he had shared lunch with or someone entirely different. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine concern along with a healthy dose of amazement at what he had just witnessed. "I'm better than okay," Kira replied, and realized that she meant it more completely than she had meant anything in months. "I can't believe you did that," Daniel said, shaking his head in amazement and disbelief. "Where did you learn to fight like that? That was incredible." "My dad taught me," Kira said simply, remembering years of patient instruction and careful drilling, hours spent learning not just techniques, but the philosophy and responsibility that came with them. "He always said I should only use it when I had absolutely no other choice. And today, you didn't have a choice." Kira thought about the question seriously, considering the months of humiliation and small cruelties, the systematic destruction of her confidence and dignity, the moment when she had realized that some people only understood one kind of language. "Today, I realized that sometimes standing up for yourself and the people you care about is the only choice that really matters," she said finally. Daniel smiled, the same genuine, warm smile that had made her heart skip a beat in the cafeteria just a few days earlier, but now carrying an additional dimension of respect and admiration that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," he said, "for standing up for me too, for not letting them destroy my artwork just because they could. Thank you for being kind to me when no one else was," Kira replied, "for trying to protect me when I couldn't protect myself." They walked toward their parents' cars together, and for the first time since arriving at Westfield High School, Kira felt like she was walking towards something positive and hopeful instead of away from something threatening and destructive. The following Monday morning brought changes that extended far beyond Kira's personal experience of school life. Students who had previously looked right through her now nodded respectfully as she passed in the hallways, not out of fear, but out of a newfound recognition of her as someone worthy of basic human courtesy. Teachers who had somehow managed to remain oblivious to months of systematic bullying now seemed to actually see her, acknowledging her presence and contributions in ways that suggested they had finally remembered that their job involved protecting all students, not just the popular ones. Most significantly, Madison Pierce, once the undisputed queen of Westfield High School's social hierarchy, now ate lunch alone at a corner table, her former followers having mysteriously discovered other interests and allegiances once they realized that their leader was no longer invincible. Kira didn't take pleasure in Madison's isolation or social downfall, but she couldn't deny the profound satisfaction that came from walking through the hallways without the constant weight of fear and anticipation. She had learned that sometimes the only way to stop a predator was to demonstrate that you were no longer willing to be prey, that there were consequences for cruelty, and that strength and kindness didn't have to be mutually exclusive. Daniel joined her for lunch every day, and their conversations ranged from art and literature to philosophy and their dreams for the future. Other students, emboldened by Kira's example and inspired by the possibility of change, began standing up to their own tormentors and refusing to accept that being different or quiet or creative made them legitimate targets for harassment. The school's rigid social hierarchy, built on fear and intimidation, and the casual cruelty of teenagers who had never been taught that their actions had consequences, began to crumble as more students realized that they didn't have to accept being victimized as the natural order of things. "You know," Daniel said one afternoon as they walked to their lockers, gesturing toward the hallway where several previously antagonistic groups of students were actually having civil conversations. "I think you changed more than just your own situation when you stood up to Madison." Kira looked around at the subtle but unmistakable shifts in behavior and social dynamics, noting the way students carried themselves with a little more confidence, the way conversations seemed more genuine and less performatively cruel. "Maybe," she said thoughtfully, "but I think the capacity for change was always there. Sometimes people just need to see that it's possible, that they don't have to accept being treated badly just because that's the way things have always been. And sometimes they need to see that there are consequences for treating others badly," Daniel added, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that suggested he had personally benefited from the new social order. Kira nodded, thinking about the months of humiliation and fear she had endured before finally taking action, wondering how many other students had suffered in silence because they believed they had no choice. "I wish I had done it sooner," she said quietly. "You did it when you were ready," Daniel replied gently, "and when it mattered most. That's what counts." As they reached their lockers, Kira caught sight of Madison at the far end of the hallway, walking alone and looking smaller somehow than she had during her reign of terror. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and instead of the usual hatred or fear, Kira saw something that might have been understanding, the recognition of a lesson learned the hard way. Madison nodded slightly, not in submission but in acknowledgement of the new reality they both inhabited, and Kira nodded back before turning to Daniel. "Want to sit together at lunch again tomorrow?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Always," he replied, and Kira knew that she had finally found her place at Westfield High School, not as the invisible girl who tried to disappear, but as someone who understood that true strength came from protecting others and refusing to let cruelty go unchallenged. The quiet girl who had once made herself invisible had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was stand up and be seen, to refuse to accept that kindness was weakness or that being different made you a legitimate target. And in discovering her own strength, she had helped others find theirs as well, creating ripples of change that extended far beyond her own experience and transformed the entire social ecosystem of their school. Strength, she had learned, wasn't about making others feel small. It was about refusing to let anyone make you feel that way about yourself and helping others find the courage to do the same.